Great, and I'll be brief. Mark, thank you for having me here today. We're a big fan of the Center for Immigration Studies. We rely on you, the Center for being kind of a thought leader for many of the issues and topics we organize around. In 2008, I was one of the founding board members of Progressives for Immigration Reform. And we created it to have a dialogue with those of our progressive brothers and sisters to the left of the political spectrum on the consequences of unbridled immigration. And at that time, much like what Jason had pointed out earlier, we were looking at our most vulnerable workers and looking at that lower end of the pay scale of our productive classes. 3 years ago, it became obvious we needed to look at what was going on at the higher end in areas of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because Americans were being displaced in the workplace, and there was a preference for hiring foreigners. And it was all legal, and it was done mostly through our employment visa system. H-1Bs, OPTs, L-1s, F-1s, J-1s, and we saw a definite, not just a preference, but a bias for preferring foreigners over Americans. So I'm really pleased today to be here to talk about this. At a higher level, let's look at this, what's going on, what has been going on. In 1980, 6 out of 7 software developers in Hudson County, New Jersey were born in the United States. Fast forward to 2017, the ratio is reversed where only 1 out of 7 software developers were born in the United States. Moving to the West Coast, Santa Clara County, California, 4 out of 5 software developers in 1980 were born in the United States. Today, that ratio has dropped to just 1 in 4. Moreover, this has come at a high cost to EEOC. The gains made by women and minorities in STEM fields over the past 3 decades have really been reversed. For example, today, on average, 12% of women earn degrees in computer science. In 1984, it was 37%. So you have to ask yourself what's going on. Well, when the opportunities become scant and the workplaces become hostile to women, they typically choose other career alternatives. So I ask the question, when you look at what has happened to the number of Americans participating in STEM versus foreigners, is it that Americans just aren't technically capable? The country that built companies like Adobe, Microsoft, Apple, put a man on the moon. Is it that our educational institutions are inferior to those in other countries? I would think not, and I'll talk about how I think it's really workplace discrimination that's making it more difficult for Americans to advance in STEM or enter and advance in STEM fields. And the way this is done, I'll give you a prime example is in 2015, Disney announced that it was laying off 850 workers. About 200 of those workers, IT workers, were tasked to train their replacements. Their IT functions were being outsourced to Tata Consultancy services, what I refer to as an Indian consulting company, an ICC. Now, that company was staffed primarily, if not entirely, by H-1B visa holders, of which the vast majority, actually 98% of the people who work in the 4 largest ICCs, Tata Consultancy Services, Infosys, HCL, Cognizant, just to name a few, 98% are from either from Southeast Asia or of Southeast Asian descent. So in that example of Disney, they outsourced to a company which is legal, and the employees had to train their H-1B visa replacements. Eventually, a lot of these jobs begin to move offshore. Another example, speaking anecdotally, in 2017, 2 years after Disney, PG&E, a utility in California, outsourced its two IT groups, the database group and the middleware group. And they outsourced to Tata Consultancy services. So everyone who had been a W-2 employee at PG&E came back the next day as a consultant employed by this ICC. Now, this year in 2019, all those Americans working for Tata Consultancy services were fired, and those jobs offshored. And interestingly enough, the only people that weren't fired working at PG&E were those who had H-1B, were on H-1B visas when it all started 2 years ago. So this is rampant. I talked about Disney, but when Toys R Us was in existence, Abbott Labs, Northeast Utilities, SoCal Edison, hundreds of companies, many of them Fortune 500 companies, have taken to outsource with a real passion. Right now, these contracting companies, these ICCs, are really in the driver's seat when it comes to hiring workers in America. And what we've seen is this almost systemic institutional bias against hiring Americans for several reasons. When you look at where the labor is coming from, it's mostly coming from India. And I'm not singling out India as the big culprit because I don't like Indians, but 74% of all of our H-1B visas go to Indian nationals. The largest outsourcing companies in America, there are others in addition to the Indian ones like Ernst & Young, Capgemini, are Indian-based. And it's a large workforce that's evidenced by roughly 72 billion in remittances go back to India each year. Mexico used to be the largest company sending remittances out of the United States. It's now India. That's an indicator of how big this issue is. Now, why I would say that there's a preference for hiring Indians over Americans in these consulting firms because, one, they will work longer hours. It's a quiescent workforce. Largely because they're here on H-1B visas. And a lot of what goes into this is they are given the hope that their company will sponsor them for a green card, and then they will eventually get citizenship here in the U.S. Unfortunately, for the American worker, that means that they're competing with someone who is willing to work for less, work for increasingly lower benefits, and ultimately makes things a lot more difficult. And this wasn't supposed to be. If you might recall, in 1992 with NAFTA, GATT, and the WTO, as we offshored all of our manufacturing base, the hope would be that Americans would learn to code. Well, it hasn't worked out that well because back then we were offshoring our manufacturing, and now we're literally asset stripping the United States, and we're taking the intellectual property between people's ears and offshoring that. And I'll give you an example of how this has played out for Americans. I mentioned SoCal Edison as one of these companies earlier that had outsourced its IT operations. Well, earlier this year, there was a court case, Buchanan versus Tata Consultancy Services, and it was an EEOC court case that dealt with country of origin discrimination. And a woman, Frances Grail, who had worked for SoCal Edison as a tech worker, was hired by Tata Consultancy Services to continue working on the SoCal Edison account. And this is an example of what goes on in these consulting firms. As I'd mentioned, these are hostile environments toward women. So in the testimony during the trial, the attorney asked the plaintiff, "Did you attend meetings as part of the Grid Ops project?" "Yes." "And were you asked to take notes?" "Yes." "Did an issue ever arise regarding your participation during these meetings?" "Yes." One time after a meeting, I had asked some questions to clarify because I know where Southern California Edison was going, wanting the application to do something a little bit differently than what it really did. Just to clarify, so after the meeting, Vishal asked me not to speak up and ask questions during meetings. So there are other instances of how this is done. I explained how it's done in outsourcing, but it's also done in hiring. There is a woman in Indiana, her name is Claire, and she got a degree in engineering, a master's degree in computer science and technology. She hasn't worked in 3 years. She was laid off from her firm 3 years ago. She applies to 2 large companies in her immediate area, and she sees the positions they're advertising for, and she is qualified for all of them. Yet at the same time, the company is applying for H-1B visas for this company, for these positions. So she's not getting hired. She's put out over 3,000 applications in the last 3 years. And this is typical of many workers that have been displaced in the STEM fields and simply can't get back in the door. And in closing, again, I'll go back to the question I asked. Is it our institutions, our educational institutions? Is it our workers? And I would like to think that it's really workplace discrimination, a bias for hiring foreigners over Americans. And as an example, there was a recent ad for a SQL developer who had to be a U.S. citizen with a DOT clearance. And this position received 268 applications online. So it tells me Americans are out there in the STEM fields wanting and willing to work. It's just that it's been very difficult.